The wedding dress hung from a nail in the cabin wall, still stained with another woman's blood, while 19-year-old Clara May Hensley adjusted the yellowed lace around her throat and prepared to marry the man who had been her mother's husband for the past 6 years. This is the story of how one Appalachian family's twisted secrets created the most sinister bride in American mountain history, a woman who would share more than just a home with the mother who birthed her. The sound of fiddles drifted through the pine-scented air of Kettle Creek Hollow on the morning of September 15, 1867, mixing with the distant clang of iron pots and the soft shuffle of bare feet on weathered porch boards. The cabin where Clara May prepared for her wedding smelled of wood smoke and mountain herbs, the rough-hewn walls holding the texture of decades of coal dust and tobacco juice that had seeped into every crevice of Appalachian life. Clara May's reflection stared back from a piece of polished tin, her pale eyes holding secrets that would have shocked even the most hardened mountain folk. At 19, she possessed the kind of sharp-featured beauty that mountain ballads warned against angular cheekbones, lips that curved too easily into a knowing smile, and an intelligence that glittered dangerously behind eyes the color of winter ice. The dress she wore had belonged to her mother, Delia Hensley, who had married Ezekiel Thorne in this same hollow 6 years earlier. But Delia wouldn't be watching her daughter's wedding from the front row of split-log benches arranged in the clearing outside. She would be standing at the altar beside Clara May, sharing the ceremony just as she had agreed to share everything else. Because in the remote hollows of post-Civil War Appalachia, where federal law barely penetrated and family loyalty superseded moral convention, the Hensley-Thorne clan had developed their own rules about marriage, property, and the bonds that tied blood to blood. Ezekiel Thorne was 43 years old, a man whose reputation for violence had kept revenue agents and circuit judges from venturing too deep into Kettle Creek Hollow. He owned 300 acres of mountain land, a working still that produced the finest corn whiskey in 3 counties. And now, through an arrangement that defied every law of God and man, he owned both mother and daughter as wives. The arrangement had begun innocently enough, or so the family would later claim. When Clara May turned 16, her mother had grown sickly with what the mountain granny women called the wasting disease, likely tuberculosis, though no doctor had ever climbed the treacherous path to Kettle Creek to make an official diagnosis. Delia could no longer perform the duties expected of a mountain wife: cooking, cleaning, tending the vegetable garden, and bearing children to work the land. Ezekiel needed a woman who could fulfill those obligations, but mountain tradition demanded loyalty to family above all else. Divorcing a sick wife was considered worse than murder in a culture where a man's word was his bond. The solution, proposed by Delia herself during a particularly difficult bout of illness, was elegantly simple and morally catastrophic. Clara May would marry Ezekiel, becoming his legal wife in the eyes of both mountain law and whatever federal authorities might eventually take interest. But Delia would remain in the household as his first wife, retaining her position and status, while Clara May assumed the physical and practical responsibilities of marriage. The two women would share not just a husband, but a home, a bed, and whatever children might result from the union. It's biblical, Delia had argued, referencing Old Testament polygamy with the kind of theological creativity that mountain preachers specialized in. Rachel and Leah both married Jacob. Sarah gave Abraham her handmaid Hagar. The good book's full of men with multiple wives. What the good book didn't contain, however, were precedents for mothers and daughters sharing the same husband, or for the kind of emotional manipulation that had made Clara May's choice inevitable. The truth was that Clara May had been in love with Ezekiel since she was 14 years old, when he'd first arrived in Kettle Creek Hollow, carrying a bullet in his shoulder and stories of the war that had consumed the outside world. He was everything the local mountain boys weren't: worldly, dangerous, and possessed of the kind of quiet authority that made strong men step aside and weak men find urgent business elsewhere. When her mother married him 2 years later, Clara May had felt something break inside her chest, a sharp pain that she'd mistaken for heartbreak, until she realized it was actually the death of her innocence. Because even at 16, she understood that her mother's proposal wasn't really about sharing domestic duties or maintaining family honor. It was about ensuring that Clara May would never leave Kettle Creek Hollow, never marry outside the family, never carry their secrets to the outside world. The wedding ceremony began at noon, conducted by Brother Josiah Cutright, a traveling preacher whose own moral flexibility made him the perfect officiant for marriages that skirted the edges of legality. 47 guests gathered in the clearing, representing every family within a day's walk of Kettle Creek Hollow. They came bearing mason jars of corn, whiskey, and wild turkey that had been hunted specifically for the occasion. What they witnessed that day would become the subject of whispered stories passed down through generations of mountain families, tales told only in the deepest winter when the snow was too thick for outsiders to travel the mountain paths. Because Clara May Hensley didn't just marry Ezekiel Thorne that September morning, she entered into a three-way union that would create the most twisted family structure in Appalachian history, setting in motion events that would eventually consume not just the participants, but everyone who chose to ignore what was happening in the hollow, where screams echoed between the mountains and nobody came to investigate. But the ceremony itself was just the beginning. The real horror would start that night, when Clara May discovered what her mother had failed to mention about the arrangements that would govern their shared marriage. Before we dive deeper into this mountain nightmare, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Drop a comment and let me know. If you're as disturbed by this twisted family dynamic as I am, hit that like button and make sure to subscribe, because the cases we explore only get darker from here. Clara May's wedding night began with her mother's hands braiding flowers into her hair. Each gentle touch, a reminder that some bonds between women become chains when men hold the keys. In the flickering candlelight of the cabin's single bedroom, 3 people prepared to sleep in the same bed, and only one of them fully understood what that meant. This wasn't just an unconventional marriage. This was the beginning of a psychological prison disguised as mountain tradition, where love and manipulation would become indistinguishable. The cabin's bedroom carried the scent of beeswax candles and dried lavender, mixed with the earthier smells of wool blankets and cedar chests that had stored wedding linens for generations. The rough pine walls seemed to press closer in the lamplight, and the floorboards creaked with the weight of secrets that had been building for months in whispered conversations between mother and daughter. Delia Hensley moved through the pre-bedtime ritual with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent weeks planning this moment. She helped Clara May out of the wedding dress, folding it carefully into the same cedar chest where it had waited since her own wedding 6 years earlier. Her movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if she were preparing her daughter for some ancient rite rather than the modern reality of sharing a husband. "You need to understand how this works," Delia said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of authority that mountain mothers used when teaching daughters the harsh realities of survival. "Ezekiel's needs are simple, but they're constant. What I can't give him anymore, you'll provide. What you can't handle yet, I'll manage. We work together, or this family falls apart." Clara May sat on the edge of the bed, a massive construction of hand-hewn oak that dominated the small room, and tried to process what her mother was actually describing. In her 19 years of life in Kettle Creek Hollow, she had heard whispers about families that operated outside conventional morality, but she had never imagined herself at the center of such arrangements. Ezekiel entered the bedroom at 9:45 p.m., carrying a mason jar of corn whiskey and wearing the kind of expression that suggested he had been dreading this conversation as much as anticipating it. At 43, he was old enough to be Clara May's father, a fact that everyone in Kettle Creek Hollow understood but nobody discussed openly. His weathered face showed the kind of lines that came from making difficult decisions and living with their consequences. "Clara May," he said, settling into a chair by the window, "Your mama's told you how we're going to manage things?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the oil lamp, heavy with implications that Clara May was only beginning to understand. Because what Delia had described as sharing domestic duties was actually a complex system of emotional and physical rotation that would govern every aspect of their daily lives. Monday through Wednesday belonged to Clara May. She would sleep beside Ezekiel, manage his meals, tend to his personal needs, and function as his primary wife in all respects. Thursday through Saturday were Delia's days, when she would resume her role as the established Mrs. Thorne, drawing on 6 years of marriage to provide the kind of companionship that came from shared history and mutual understanding. Sundays were family days, when all three would participate in household activities together, attending the traveling preacher's services, or managing the seasonal work that kept their mountain homestead profitable. But what about Clara May started, then stopped, unsure how to articulate her confusion about the intimate aspects of the arrangement. "What about what?" Delia prompted, though her knowing smile suggested she understood exactly what her daughter was struggling to ask. "What about when children come?" Clara May finally managed. "Whose children will they be?" The question revealed the true complexity of the arrangement they were proposing. In a culture where bloodlines determined inheritance and family identity, the children born to this unconventional union would exist in a legal and social gray area that could create problems for generations. Ezekiel's response demonstrated the kind of practical mountain logic that prioritized survival over sentiment. "Any child born in this house will be a thorn, with full rights to land and name. The details of motherhood can be worked out when the time comes." It was a non-answer that avoided the biological reality that Clara May's children would also be Delia's grandchildren, creating a family tree that twisted back on itself in ways that defied conventional understanding. But there was another layer to the arrangement that neither Delia nor Ezekiel had explained fully: the emotional dynamics that would develop between three adults sharing intimate space in a culture that barely recognized individual privacy. Under normal circumstances, the boundaries between mother and daughter would inevitably blur when both women were competing for the attention and approval of the same man. The natural tensions between generations would intensify when filtered through romantic jealousy and sexual rivalry. Most dangerously, the power dynamics that govern traditional mountain marriages would become hopelessly complicated when two wives occupied different positions in both the family hierarchy and the marital relationship. Clara May spent her wedding night lying between her new husband and her mother, listening to the mountain wind rattle the cabin windows and wondering what she had agreed to become. The physical arrangement was awkward enough: 3 adults in a bed designed for 2, each trying to find comfortable positions that didn't intrude on the other's space. But the psychological implications were far more disturbing. Every gesture of affection between Clara May and Ezekiel would be witnessed by Delia. Every intimate moment would become a performance observed by the woman who had given birth to one participant and married the other. Privacy, already a rare commodity in mountain life, would become impossible. Some families create their own rules. By morning, Clara May understood that her mother's generous offer to share domestic responsibilities was actually an elaborate form of control. Delia would remain the senior wife, the established mistress of the household, while Clara May provided the youth and energy that her mother could no longer contribute. But Clara May would never be allowed to fully replace her mother, never permitted to establish her own independent relationship with Ezekiel. She was trapped in a marriage that was also an elaborate form of servitude, bound to a man she loved and a mother she could never escape. The wedding had been real, the ceremony legally binding, but the life it created would prove to be something far more sinister than either traditional marriage or simple polygamy. Because Delia Hensley had not just arranged for her daughter to marry her husband, she had created a system where Clara May's natural desires and maternal loyalty would be used against her. ensuring that the young woman would remain in Kettle Creek Hollow forever, tied to a family dynamic that would gradually destroy her ability to distinguish between love and manipulation. But the true horror of their arrangement wouldn't become clear until Clara May discovered what had happened to Ezekiel's first wife, the woman whose blood still stained the wedding dress that now hung in their shared closet, and whose disappearance had created the opening that allowed Delia to marry him in the first place. The bloodstains on the wedding dress weren't from any accident. Clara May discovered 3 weeks after her marriage, when she found the yellowed letter hidden beneath loose floorboards that spelled out exactly how Ezekiel's first wife had died and who had killed her. The scratching of mice in the walls suddenly seemed less like rodents and more like whispers of the woman who had worn that dress before Delia, before Clara May, before the mountain hollow learned to keep its deadliest secrets buried. This wasn't just a story about sharing a husband. This was about a pattern of violence that had been perfected over years, with each new wife becoming both victim and accomplice to the next woman's destruction. The morning air in Kettle Creek Hollow carried the sharp bite of early October frost, mixed with the smoky scent of burning leaves and the metallic tang that always seemed to linger near the old well behind the cabin. Clara May's bare feet found the familiar grooves in the wooden floor as she moved through her morning chores, each step taking her past the spot where she had discovered something that changed everything she thought she knew about her family. It had started as a simple repair job. One of the bedroom floorboards had worked loose during a recent rainstorm, creating a gap that caught the hem of Clara May's nightgown and nearly sent her tumbling. When she pried up the board to hammer it back into place, she found a cavity beneath the floor that contained more than just construction debris. Wrapped in oiled cloth and tied with a faded ribbon was a bundle of letters, photographs, and documents that told the story of Sarah Millicent Thorne, Ezekiel's first wife, who had supposedly died of consumption in the winter of 1859, 2 years before Delia arrived in Kettle Creek Hollow. The letters were written in Sarah's hand, addressed to her sister in Charleston, but never sent. The photographs showed a young woman with dark hair and intelligent eyes, posed in the formal style that frontier photographers favored. But it was the final document, a letter dated 3 days before Sarah's alleged death, that revealed the truth about what had happened in the cabin where Clara May now lived. December 18th, 1859. My dearest sister Margaret, if you receive this letter, it means the worst has happened, and I am no longer able to protect myself from the evil that has taken root in this household. Ezekiel has brought another woman into our home, claims she is here to help with my illness, but I have seen the way they look at each other when they think I am sleeping. I fear what they plan to do when my usefulness has ended. The mountain granny women speak of wives who disappear when younger women arrive to take their place. I pray I am wrong, but if something happens to me, know that it was not consumption that took my life. Look for my body near the old mining shaft on the North Ridge. Do not trust the story they will tell about my death. The letter was signed with a shaking hand, and the paper bore brown stains that Clara May now realized were not from age or dampness. Sarah Millicent Thorne had known she was going to die, had understood that her husband and his mistress were planning her murder, and had tried to leave evidence that would reveal the truth about what happened to wives who became inconvenient. Clara May's hands trembled as she read the letter for the 3rd time, understanding dawning like a cold mountain sunrise. The pattern was clear. Ezekiel found wives when he needed them, kept them as long as they were useful, and disposed of them when younger replacements became available. Sarah had been replaced by Delia. Now, Clara May was being positioned to eventually replace her mother when age and illness made Delia as expendable as Sarah had been. But there was more in the hidden cache than just Sarah's final letter. Beneath the documents lay a small leather journal filled with Delia's handwriting, entries that dated back to her first arrival in Kettle Creek Hollow. The journal revealed that Delia hadn't stumbled into the mountains by accident or answered some innocent advertisement for a housekeeper. She had been recruited specifically to replace Sarah brought into the household with the explicit understanding that her role would expand from servant to mistress to wife. Once the current Mrs. Thorne was no longer an obstacle. January 15th, 1860. Sarah passed in her sleep last night, peaceful as a lamb. Ezekiel says the consumption finally took her, but we both know better. The tea I've been giving her these past weeks worked exactly as the root woman promised it would. No pain, no struggle, just a gradual weakening until her heart stopped. She's buried now beside the creek, and I'll wear her wedding dress when Ezekiel and I marry next month. Waste not, want not, as Mama always said. The casual tone of the entry, the matter-of-fact description of poisoning another woman, revealed a level of calculated evil that made Clara May's blood freeze in her veins. Her mother hadn't just been complicit in Sarah's death. She had been the primary instrument of murder, using knowledge gained from mountain folk medicine to slowly kill the woman whose place she intended to take. And now, Clara May realized with growing horror, she was living the same story that Sarah had lived, sleeping in the same bed, wearing the same wedding dress, and being prepared for the same fate when her usefulness expired. The pattern became clear when Clara May examined the other items hidden beneath the floorboard. There were locks of hair from multiple women, pressed flowers that had been used in wedding bouquets, and small pieces of jewelry that suggested Ezekiel and Delia's partnership had been refined through practice on victims whose names Clara May would never know. How many wives had lived in this cabin? How many women had discovered their fate too late to escape? How many bodies were buried in unmarked graves scattered through the mountains of Kettle Creek Hollow? That evening, as Clara May sat at the dinner table with her husband and mother, she watched their faces with new understanding. Every smile from Delia carried the memory of Sarah's poisoning. Every gentle touch from Ezekiel was tainted by the knowledge that his hands had buried multiple wives in mountain soil. The love she had felt for both of them was revealed as a carefully constructed illusion, designed to make her compliant until her replacement could be found and trained. But Clara May possessed something that Sarah apparently had not: the mountain cunning that came from growing up in a culture where survival depended on reading people's true intentions beneath their spoken words. She understood that her only chance of survival lay not in escape. The mountains were too vast and dangerous for a woman traveling alone, but in becoming more dangerous than the people who intended to kill her. That night, as Delia and Ezekiel slept peacefully beside her, Clara May made a decision that would transform her from victim into something far more terrifying. She would not wait passively for her turn to be replaced and murdered. Instead, she would take control of the pattern that had governed life and death in Kettle Creek Hollow for over a decade. She would become the most sinister bride in Appalachian history by ensuring that she would be the last wife any of them would ever need. But first, she needed to understand exactly how many women had died in this cabin and where their bodies were buried, because Clara May had realized that her mother and husband had made one crucial mistake in their years of perfecting murder. They had kept trophies, and trophies could become evidence in the right hands. The question was whether those hands would belong to law enforcement from the outside world or to a 19-year-old mountain girl who had just learned that love and murder were often indistinguishable in the hollows where civilization feared to tread. Clara May's lantern cast dancing shadows across the stone walls of the root cellar as she counted the skulls that lined the shelves, like mason jars full of preserved peaches. 17 women's faces grinning back at her in the provoque. Flickering light, each one representing a wife who had trusted the wrong people with her life. The damp air smelled of earth and old bones, and the silence pressed against her ears like the weight of accumulated secrets that had been rotting beneath her family's cabin for over a decade. This wasn't just serial murder, this was a family business passed down through generations, with each new bride serving as both customer and product in an economy built on the systematic elimination of inconvenient women. The root cellar beneath the Thorn cabin had been dug during the harsh winter of 1852, carved into the mountain bedrock to store vegetables and preserved meat through the seasons when fresh food became scarce. But at some point in its 15-year history, the cellar had been repurposed to serve a darker function that turned Clara May's stomach, even as it revealed the full scope of her family's depravity. The shelves that should have held turnips and potatoes instead displayed a carefully organized collection of human remains, each skull positioned at eye level, with the kind of respectful attention that hunters might show to prized trophy mounts. But these weren't random victims of mountain violence or Civil War casualties. These were women who had lived in the cabin above, slept in the same bed where Clara May now spent her nights, and trusted Ezekiel and Delia with their lives, until trust became the instrument of their destruction. Small wooden plaques beneath each skull bore names and dates written in Delia's careful handwriting. Margaret Boone, 1851, 1852. Baron, talk too much. Ruth Collier, 1852, 1854. Weak constitution, poor cooking. Hannah Grace, 1854, 1855. Lazy, complained about work. Each plaque read like a performance evaluation that had ended in execution, a bureaucratic approach to murder that suggested years of refinement and practice. But it was the newest addition to the collection that made Clara May's knees buckle with the realization of how close she had come to joining the display. A fresh plaque sat empty on the shelf, positioned precisely where the next skull would rest. Clara May Hensley, 1867. The date of death had been left blank, but the fact that her memorial had already been prepared suggested that her murder was not a matter of if, but when. A leather-bound ledger on the cellar's workbench contained detailed records of each woman's recruitment, training, and disposal, written in the clinical language of someone who had transformed killing into a systematic process. The entries revealed that Ezekiel and Delia's partnership had been operating far longer than Clara May had realized, with roots that extended back to before the Civil War and victims drawn from across the mountain region. November 3rd, 1851. Margaret Boone arrived from Asheville as advertised. Good teeth, strong back, claims experience with livestock. Ezekiel pleased with selection. Integration process begins tomorrow. March 15th, 1852. Margaret showing signs of suspicion regarding previous wives, asking uncomfortable questions about Sarah Millicent's belongings found in trunk. Termination scheduled for next week during supply trip to town. March 23rd, 1852. Margaret dispatched without complications. Used new method with crushed peach pits in morning coffee. Slower than previous techniques, but leaves no obvious traces. Body disposed in usual location. Recruitment for replacement begins immediately. The entries continued for over 15 years, documenting a production line approach to marriage and murder that had claimed women from across Appalachia. Some had been recruited through newspaper advertisements for housekeepers and companions. Others had been targeted at churches, social gatherings, or trading posts where isolated women might be vulnerable to offers of security and companionship. A few had simply been travelers who had made the mistake of accepting hospitality from the wrong mountain family. The methodology had been refined through practice until Ezekiel and Delia could eliminate a wife and install her replacement within weeks, maintaining the appearance of a stable household while cycling through victims with the efficiency of a well-managed business operation. The isolated location of Kettle Creek Hollow provided perfect cover. No neighbors close enough to notice patterns. No law enforcement willing to investigate domestic situations in remote mountain areas. And a culture of family privacy that discouraged uncomfortable questions about wives who disappeared. But the most disturbing discovery in the cellar wasn't the evidence of past murders, it was the preparation for future ones. A second workbench held bottles of various poisons, surgical tools for dismembering bodies, and lime for accelerating decomposition. Maps of the surrounding mountains showed burial locations marked with small X's, creating a grim constellation of unmarked graves scattered across the ridges and hollows of Kettle Creek. Most chilling of all was a detailed floor plan of the cabin above, showing escape routes, hiding places for evidence, and optimal positions for overpowering unsuspecting victims. The drawing revealed that every aspect of the Thorne household had been designed with murder in mind, from the isolated bedroom, where victims could be killed without witnesses, to the root cellar, where bodies could be processed without detection. Clara May understood now why the arrangement with her mother had been structured the way it was. Delia wasn't sharing her husband out of generosity or family loyalty. She was training her replacement, while simultaneously positioning herself to orchestrate Clara May's eventual murder when a younger, more attractive candidate became available. The mother-daughter dynamic provided perfect cover for the grooming process, allowing Delia to study Clara May's habits, identify her weaknesses, and plan the most effective method for her elimination. The pattern was clear: recruit, integrate, exploit, eliminate, replace. Clara May was currently in the exploit phase, providing domestic and sexual services while being systematically isolated from outside connections that might notice her absence. When her usefulness declined or a better option appeared, she would move to the eliminate phase, followed by the arrival of a new young woman who would begin the cycle again. But as Clara May studied the evidence of her family's crimes, she began to understand something that neither Ezekiel nor Delia had anticipated. The very isolation and manipulation they had used to control their victims could be turned against them. The remote location that protected them from outside interference also meant that their own disappearances would be unlikely to attract investigation. The careful records they had kept to perfect their methods could be used to document their own guilt. Most importantly, the trust they had placed in Clara May, bringing her into their confidence, sharing their secrets, teaching her their techniques, had provided her with everything she needed to destroy them. Love dies in dark places. That night, as Clara May lay between her husband and mother, she felt the weight of 17 murdered women pressing down on her like mountain stone. But she also felt something else: the cold clarity that comes from understanding exactly what kind of people she was dealing with, and exactly what would happen to her if she continued to play the role of victim. Clara May Hensley had entered the root cellar as a frightened young woman who had just discovered that her family were killers. She emerged as something far more dangerous: a mountain girl who had learned that sometimes the only way to stop monsters is to become something worse than they are. The question now was whether she would use that knowledge to escape Kettle Creek Hollow, or to ensure that no other women would ever be added to the trophy collection that lined the shelves below her marriage bed. The screaming from the root cellar stopped at exactly 11:23 p.m. on October 31st, 1867, replaced by a silence so complete that even the mountain wind seemed to hold its breath. Clara May climbed the wooden steps with blood on her hands and a new understanding of what it meant to be the most dangerous person in Kettle Creek Hollow, carrying Delia's severed finger as proof that some lessons can only be taught through pain. This was the night a 19-year-old bride discovered that the difference between victim and predator often comes down to who strikes first and who strikes hardest. The autumn air in the cabin carried the metallic scent of fresh blood mixed with the earthy smell of disturbed soil, creating an atmosphere thick with violence and the promise of more to come. Clara May set the oil lamp on the kitchen table with steady hands, her pale eyes reflecting the flame, as she examined the finger she had removed from her mother's left hand with surgical precision, learned from studying the tools in the root cellar. Delia sat bound to a wooden chair, her face white with shock and pain, a strip of torn bedsheet stuffed in her mouth to muffle the sounds that had echoed through the hollow for the past 2 hours. Blood seeped through the bandage. Clara May had wrapped around the wound, professional enough to prevent fatal bleeding, but crude enough to ensure maximum discomfort. "You're probably wondering how I knew," Clara May said conversationally, settling into the chair across from her mother with the casual ease of someone discussing the weather. "About the poison you've been putting in my food. About the recruitment letter you sent to that girl in Beckley. About the plans you and Ezekiel made to dispose of me before Christmas." The bound woman's eyes widened above the gag, revealing the first crack in the composed facade that Delia had maintained throughout her years of systematic murder. Clara May had not just discovered her family's crimes, she had been studying them, learning from them, and preparing to improve upon their methods with the kind of mountain cunning that came from generations of survival in hostile territory. The transformation had begun 3 weeks earlier, when Clara May found the trophy collection in the root cellar. But instead of running or confronting her killers directly, she had done something that neither Ezekiel nor Delia expected. She had started taking notes, studying their techniques, and identifying the weaknesses in their system that could be exploited by someone with superior intelligence and fewer moral constraints. The first weakness was their reliance on routine. Ezekiel left the cabin every Tuesday and Friday to check his still and conduct business with customers who bought his corn whiskey. During these absences, Delia would slip small amounts of arsenic into Clara May's food, gradually weakening her constitution in preparation for the sudden illness that would justify her death. But Clara May had been switching their meals for weeks, ensuring that Delia consumed her own poison while Clara May built up immunity through carefully controlled exposure. The second weakness was their assumption that Clara May's youth and inexperience made her incapable of violence. They had observed her gentle behavior with animals, her reluctance to kill chickens for dinner, and her emotional reactions to their stories about previous wives. What they failed to understand was that mountain women learned early to distinguish between necessary violence and cruelty, and that Clara May's moral flexibility had been shaped by years of watching her mother manipulate others through false kindness. The third weakness was their trust in the isolation of Kettle Creek Hollow. They believed that their remote location protected them from discovery and consequences, never considering that isolation worked both ways. No one would come looking for Ezekiel or Delia any more than they had come looking for the 17 women buried in unmarked graves throughout the mountains. Clara May had spent the past month systematically exploiting these weaknesses while preparing for the confrontation that would determine whether she lived to see her 20th birthday. She had learned to forge Ezekiel's handwriting by practicing with samples from his business correspondence. She had memorized the locations of burial sites by studying the maps in the root cellar. Most importantly, she had identified which of their regular customers might be willing to purchase information about Ezekiel's activities from someone who could provide detailed evidence of his crimes. The finger she had removed from Delia's hand wasn't random violence. It was a carefully calculated message designed to demonstrate that Clara May had transcended the role of victim and assumed the position of judge, jury, and executioner for crimes that had gone unpunished for over a decade. "Where is Ezekiel?" Clara May asked, removing the gag from her mother's mouth with the same gentle touch she had used when braiding flowers in Delia's hair on her wedding night. "Gone to check the still," Delia gasped, her voice hoarse from screaming. "Won't be back until morning. Clara May, you don't understand what you're doing. We're family. I'm your mother. Everything I did was to protect you, to give you security and a home." The response revealed how completely Delia had convinced herself that systematic murder was actually maternal love, that destroying other women was somehow beneficial to her daughter's welfare. It was the kind of psychological compartmentalization that allowed people to commit atrocities while maintaining their self-image as good, decent folk who were simply doing what circumstances required. Clara May's laugh carried the bitter edge of someone who had learned too much truth in too short a time. Protect me? You were fattening me up for slaughter, just like you did to Sarah and Margaret and all the others. I read your journal, Mama. I know how this story was supposed to end. The use of the childhood name Mama in the context of their current situation demonstrated Clara May's mastery of the psychological techniques her mother had used for years. The affectionate term created cognitive dissonance, forcing Delia to confront the contradiction between her maternal identity and her murderous actions. You have a choice, Clara May continued, her voice taking on the same reasonable tone that Delia had used when explaining the arrangement that brought Clara May into Ezekiel's bed. You can tell me everything about how this operation works, the customers, the burial sites, the recruitment methods, the financial arrangements, or you can lose another finger and hope that Ezekiel finds your body before the rats do. The threat wasn't empty posturing. Clara May had discovered that she possessed an unexpected talent for violence, a capacity for inflicting pain that surprised even her own understanding of her personality. The mountain environment that had shaped her childhood had also shaped her capacity for survival, creating someone who could transition from victim to predator with the kind of smooth efficiency that suggested the potential had always been present, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. Delia's cooperation over the next 4 hours provided Clara May with a comprehensive education in the business of systematic murder. The operation generated significant income through the sale of victims' belongings, the acquisition of their savings and property, and ongoing payments from customers who valued the discretion that came with dealing with people who had no legal existence. The network extended far beyond Kettle Creek Hollow, connecting with similar operations throughout Appalachia and creating a regional economy built on the exploitation and elimination of vulnerable women. But the most valuable information Delia provided was the revelation that Ezekiel had been planning to eliminate her as well, replacing both mother and daughter with a pair of sisters from Tennessee who would provide fresh blood for the operation while eliminating witnesses to past crimes. Blood calls to blood. By dawn, Clara May had acquired everything she needed to transform herself from victim to victor in the most twisted family drama in Appalachian history. But her education in violence was just beginning, because Ezekiel would return from his business trip expecting to find a compliant wife and her cooperative mother, not a mountain girl who had learned that sometimes the only way to stop a monster is to become something worse. The question now was whether Clara May would use her newfound knowledge to escape the hollow, or to build something even more sinister on the foundation of bones that previous generations had laid beneath the mountain soil. Ezekiel Thorne's boots hit the cabin porch at 6:17 a.m., heavy with the confidence of a man returning to a household where he controlled every breath, every heartbeat, every decision about who lived and who died. What he found instead was his wife, Clara May, sitting calmly at the kitchen table, sipping coffee from a cup stained with what looked suspiciously like blood, while his other wife lay butchered in pieces that had been arranged with the artistic precision of someone who had learned anatomy from studying 17 previous victims. This was the moment when the most dangerous man in Kettle Creek Hollow discovered that predators sometimes create prey who evolve into something far more lethal than their original hunters. The morning light streaming through the cabin windows illuminated a scene that defied Ezekiel's understanding of power dynamics and family hierarchy. Delia's remains had been distributed throughout the kitchen with methodical care, her torso propped in the rocking chair where she had spent countless evenings planning murders, her severed hands positioned on the table as if she were still kneading biscuit dough, and her head placed on the windowsill, facing the path Ezekiel would take on his return from the still. The arrangement wasn't random violence or emotional breakdown. It was a carefully constructed message designed to communicate that the balance of power in the Thorne household had shifted permanently, and that the man who had killed 17 women was now facing someone who had studied his methods and improved upon them with the kind of cold intelligence that mountain survival had bred into her bones. Clara May looked up from her coffee cup as Ezekiel froze in the doorway, his weathered face cycling through expressions of shock, rage, and something approaching fear as he processed what he was seeing. His hand moved instinctively toward the knife at his belt, but Clara May's slight shake of her head and the casual way she gestured toward Delia's severed finger, resting beside her cup, suggested that any aggressive movement would be both futile and fatal. "Morning, husband," Clara May said with the same cheerful tone she had used during their brief courtship. "Mama won't be joining us for breakfast today. She's indisposed." The understatement demonstrated Clara May's mastery of the psychological techniques that mountain folk use to maintain composure in extreme circumstances. By treating horrific violence as a minor domestic inconvenience, she was establishing emotional dominance over a man who had built his reputation on being the most feared person in 3 counties. Ezekiel's voice, when he finally found it, carried the hoarse quality of someone whose fundamental assumptions about reality had been shattered in the span of a single glance. "Clara May, what have you done?" "I've been getting an education," she replied, rising from her chair with fluid grace that suggested complete comfort with her new role as the household's primary threat. "Learning about the family business, studying the ledgers in the root cellar, understanding how the operation really works." She moved through the kitchen with the confident stride of someone who had taken ownership of her environment, stepping around pieces of her mother's corpse as casually as she might avoid puddles after a rainstorm. The transformation from frightened bride to calculating killer had occurred so completely that Ezekiel found himself dealing with a stranger who happened to inhabit his wife's body. "Mama was very helpful," Clara May continued, settling against the kitchen counter in a position that blocked Ezekiel's access to both the front door and the weapons stored near the fireplace. She explained the recruitment process, the financial arrangements, the disposal methods, even showed me where the new girls were coming from. The reference to new girls hit Ezekiel like a physical blow, revealing that Clara May had discovered the correspondence with the Tennessee sisters, who were supposed to replace both mother and daughter in the operation. His carefully constructed plans for eliminating witnesses and refreshing his stable of wives had been exposed and analyzed by someone whose intelligence he had consistently underestimated. "I also learned some interesting things about your first wife," Clara May added, her pale eyes reflecting the morning light with an intensity that made Ezekiel's skin crawl. "Sarah Millicent, the one who supposedly died of consumption. Mama was very chatty about what really happened to her." The mention of Sarah's name opened old wounds that Ezekiel had thought were safely buried with her body in the mountain soil. Sarah had been different from the other wives, stronger, smarter, more suspicious of the circumstances surrounding her marriage. Her death had been messier than the others, requiring more violence and leaving psychological scars that still influenced his dreams 15 years later. "Sarah tried to warn people," Clara May continued, moving closer to her husband with the stalking gait of a predator closing distance to prey. "Left letters. Tried to get word to the outside world about what was happening here. Mama poisoned her before she could expose the operation, but not before Sarah had time to hide evidence that could have destroyed everything you'd built." The revelation that evidence of their crimes had been hidden in the cabin for over a decade demonstrated how completely Ezekiel and Delia had lost control of their own operation. They had become so confident in their methods, so secure in their isolation, that they had stopped considering the possibility that their victims might be intelligent enough to leave behind documentation of their murders. "What do you want?" Ezekiel asked, his voice carrying the exhausted tone of someone who was beginning to understand that his position as dominant predator had been permanently compromised. Clara May's smile revealed teeth that seemed sharper than they had been during their courtship, an optical illusion created by the kind of predatory confidence that transformed ordinary features into instruments of intimidation. "I want what every wife wants," she said sweetly. "A stable home, financial security, and a husband who respects her intelligence." The conventional language applied to their unconventional situation created cognitive dissonance that left Ezekiel struggling to formulate appropriate responses. Clara May was simultaneously acknowledging their marriage and threatening his life, expressing domestic desires while surrounded by evidence of her capacity for extreme violence. "The operation continues," Clara May explained, settling back into her chair and gesturing for Ezekiel to join her at the table where Delia's severed hands still rested, but with some modifications to improve efficiency and reduce unnecessary risks. What followed was Clara May's detailed proposal for reorganizing their murder-for-profit enterprise based on observations she had made while studying their methods and identifying weaknesses that could be exploited by law enforcement or rival criminals. Her suggestions revealed not just intelligence, but a natural talent for systematic violence that surpassed even Ezekiel's years of experience. Death is the family trade. The most chilling aspect of Clara May's plan wasn't its attention to detail or its cold calculation of profit margins. It was her casual assumption that Ezekiel would accept his new role as junior partner in an operation that she now controlled, acknowledging her intellectual superiority and submitting to her leadership in matters of life and death. Because Clara May Hensley had learned the most important lesson that Appalachian survival could teach. Sometimes the only way to ensure your own safety is to become more dangerous than everyone around you, including the people who claim to love you. But her proposal came with conditions that would test whether Ezekiel was truly willing to accept his diminished status, or whether his pride would force him to challenge the mountain girl who had just proven herself capable of butchering her own mother without losing a moment's sleep. The sound of shovels biting into frozen mountain earth echoed across Kettle Creek Hollow as Clara May and Ezekiel worked side by side, digging what would be the last grave either of them would ever need to excavate by hand. The December wind carried the scent of pine needles and decomposition mixed with the sweat of two people who were learning that some partnerships require blood sacrifice to seal the agreement between predators who have found their perfect match. This wasn't just the burial of Delia Hensley. This was the birth of something unprecedented in Appalachian criminal history. A husband-wife team whose combined talents would make their previous operation look like amateur hour compared to the systematic perfection they were about to unleash. The grave they dug on December 23, 1867, was positioned exactly 47 paces from the cabin's back door, close enough for convenience, but far enough to avoid contaminating their water supply. Clara May had chosen the location after studying topographical maps and testing soil composition, applying scientific methodology to body disposal in ways that demonstrated her natural aptitude for improving upon existing criminal techniques. Ezekiel worked with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had dug dozens of similar graves over the years, but his movements carried a new tension that reflected his evolving relationship with the woman who now stood as his equal and potentially his superior in matters of violence and strategic planning. The easy dominance he had enjoyed over previous wives had been replaced by something more complex and dangerous. Genuine partnership with someone whose capacity for evil matched his own. "The Tennessee Sisters will arrive next week," Clara May said, pausing to wipe grave dirt from her hands with the same methodical care she had once used for kitchen chores. "I've been corresponding with them using your letterhead, confirming travel arrangements, and discussing their expectations for employment." The casual mention of their next victims demonstrated how completely Clara May had absorbed the business aspects of their operation. She wasn't just participating in murder, she was actively managing customer acquisition and inventory control with the kind of attention to detail that successful criminals required to avoid detection and maintain profitability. "What did you tell them?" Ezekiel asked, his voice carrying the cautious respect that one predator shows another when territory boundaries are still being negotiated. "The truth, mostly," Clara May replied with a smile that would have seemed innocent to anyone who hadn't seen her dismember her mother with surgical precision. "That we're a mountain family looking for domestic help, that we offer good wages and comfortable accommodations, and that we value discretion and loyalty above all other qualities. The advertisement would attract exactly the kind of isolated, desperate women who had been feeding their operation for years. Young women with limited options, few family connections, and the kind of trusting nature that made them vulnerable to predators who specialized in exploiting kindness and hope. But Clara May's recruitment strategy contained refinements that reflected lessons learned from studying previous failures. Instead of targeting single women who might be missed by concerned relatives, she had begun focusing on pairs of sisters or friends whose disappearances could be attributed to their decision to travel together to new opportunities. The psychological dynamic between paired victims would create additional control mechanisms while providing built-in explanations for their absence from previous communities. Once they arrive, we'll have a trial period. Clara May continued, settling the details of their future victims' fates with the same planning that other wives might apply to holiday meal preparation. Evaluate their skills, assess their intelligence, determine which one shows more promise for long-term usefulness. The clinical language disguised the reality that Clara May was describing a selection process that would determine which sister died first and which would be kept alive long enough to provide additional labor and entertainment before her. Eventual disposal. She had learned to think about human lives as inventory, resources to be managed and consumed according to business needs rather than emotional considerations. Ezekiel found himself both attracted to and disturbed by Clara May's evolution from victim to partner. Her intelligence and ruthlessness provided exactly the kind of collaboration he had never found with previous wives, who had been chosen for their vulnerability rather than their capacity for strategic thinking. But her rapid mastery of their criminal methodology also represented a potential threat to his own survival if their partnership ever soured. "What about the bodies?" he asked, gesturing toward the grave, where they had recently interred the last physical evidence of Delia's existence. Clara May's response revealed the extent to which she had been thinking beyond their immediate needs. "I've identified several abandoned mine shafts that would provide better disposal options. Deeper, more remote, less chance of discovery by hunters or revenue agents. We could also explore chemical methods for accelerating decomposition." The suggestion demonstrated her understanding that their previous disposal methods, while adequate for a small-scale operation, would need upgrading to handle the increased volume she was planning. Clara May wasn't just thinking about their next victims. She was designing infrastructure for systematic murder on an unprecedented scale. But the most significant change in their partnership wasn't tactical or strategic. It was the psychological dynamic that had developed between two people who had found in each other the kind of understanding that only exists between individuals who share the same fundamental disconnect from human empathy and moral constraint. For the first time in his criminal career, Ezekiel was working with someone who didn't need to be coerced, manipulated, or controlled into participating in murder. Clara May had chosen violence freely, embracing it with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested she had finally found her true calling after years of pretending to be someone she wasn't. The partnership they were forging in Delia's grave would prove more dangerous than the sum of its parts, combining Ezekiel's experience and connections with Clara May's intelligence and innovation to create something that transcended traditional criminal categories. They weren't just serial killers or profit-motivated murderers. They were evolving into something that law enforcement had never encountered before. Some bonds are forged in blood. As they finished covering Delia's remains with mountain soil, Clara May and Ezekiel were completing more than just the disposal of evidence. They were finalizing the transformation of their marriage from a relationship based on deception and planned murder into a genuine partnership built on shared appreciation for violence and mutual respect for each other's capacity for evil. The Tennessee sisters would provide their first opportunity to test the effectiveness of their new collaborative approach, but Clara May had already begun planning beyond their immediate victims. Her vision for their operation included expansion into neighboring counties, development of more sophisticated techniques, and the creation of a criminal enterprise that could operate indefinitely without detection. Because Clara May Hensley had discovered something that would make her the most sinister bride in Appalachian history, she didn't just have a talent for killing, she had a talent for teaching others how to kill better. And she had found in Ezekiel Thorne, a student who was eager to learn everything she could show him about perfecting the art of making people disappear. But their partnership would face its ultimate test when the Tennessee sisters arrived carrying secrets of their own, and Clara May discovered that some prey fight back in ways that even the most dangerous predators don't anticipate. The cabin door exploded inward at dawn on January 15, 1868, splintering wood and dreams alike as federal marshals poured into Kettle Creek Hollow, with warrants signed by judges who had finally grown tired of missing persons reports that all pointed toward the same remote mountain address. Clara May stood calmly in her nightgown, hands raised in surrender, while beside her, Ezekiel reached for a rifle that would never clear its rack before 3 bullets found their mark in his chest. This was the morning when the most sinister bride in Appalachian history learned that some students eventually surpassed their teachers by knowing exactly when to stop learning and start running. The sound of splintering wood, mixed with shouted commands, and the metallic click of rifle hammers being drawn back to full cock, creating a symphony of violence that had been building for months as reports filtered out of the mountains about disappearances, unmarked graves, and a mountain family whose hospitality had become synonymous with death throughout 3 counties. Marshal Clayton Hartwell kicked aside the remnants of the front door, his weathered face grim with the kind of determination that came from tracking killers across 200 miles of hostile terrain in the dead of winter. Behind him, 6 deputies spread through the cabin, with the practiced efficiency of men who had learned to expect resistance from criminals who had nothing left to lose. What they found instead was a scene that would haunt their reports for years to come. Clara May Hensley, standing beside the kitchen table where breakfast had been interrupted by justice, her pale eyes reflecting the morning light with the kind of calm that suggested she had been expecting this moment for weeks. Beside her, Ezekiel Thorne lay dying from 3 chest wounds, his blood pooling on floorboards that had absorbed the evidence of dozens of previous murders. "Mrs. Thorne," Marshal Hartwell said, his voice carrying the formal courtesy that lawmen used when addressing suspects who might still possess hidden weapons or unexpected allies. "You're under arrest for the murders of Sarah Millicent, Thorne, Delia Hensley, and 17 other women whose remains we've recovered from your property." Clara May's response would be quoted in newspaper accounts across the region, demonstrating the kind of composed intelligence that had made her so effective as a predator. "Marshal, I believe you'll find the evidence supports a more complex interpretation of recent events. I'd be happy to provide testimony that clarifies the actual sequence of crimes and identifies the primary perpetrators." The offer revealed Clara May's final transformation from victim to survivor, showing that she had anticipated this confrontation and prepared a strategy for emerging from it with her life intact. While Ezekiel had relied on isolation and intimidation to protect their operation, Clara May had been planning for the possibility of discovery and developing contingency plans that would allow her to shift responsibility for their crimes onto shoulders that were no longer able to bear witness against her. The testimony she provided over the next 3 days would become legendary among frontier law enforcement, a masterpiece of selective truth-telling that painted her as a victim of generational abuse, who had been forced to participate in her family's crimes through threats, manipulation, and fear for her own survival. Her account described Ezekiel and Delia as the operation's masterminds, portraying herself as a reluctant accomplice whose cooperation had been secured through psychological torture and the constant threat of becoming their next victim. "I tried to save them," Clara May told the federal court in Beckley, her voice breaking with emotion that seemed genuine to everyone who heard it. "I tried to warn the women who came to our hollow, to help them escape before it was too late. But Ezekiel and my mother had ways of ensuring my silence." They showed me the graves of previous wives who had tried to resist, made it clear that cooperation was the only way to survive. The performance was flawless, combining enough truth to be believable with enough misdirection to obscure Clara May's actual role in planning and executing murders. She produced Sarah Millicent's hidden letters as evidence of the operation's history, while omitting her own journal entries that documented her evolution from victim to partner. She guided investigators to burial sites, while claiming her knowledge came from being forced to watch disposals rather than participating in them. Most crucially, she presented Delia's murder as self-defense, describing a desperate struggle between a daughter trying to escape and a mother determined to silence her before she could expose their crimes. The physical evidence supported her account. Delia's body showed signs of defensive wounds that suggested a fight rather than a calculated execution. The federal court, faced with a young woman whose testimony provided the key to solving dozens of disappearances across the mountain region, chose to focus on her cooperation rather than her culpability. Clara May was sentenced to 5 years in the federal women's prison in Atlanta with the possibility of parole, after 3 years for good behavior and continued assistance with ongoing investigations into Appalachian criminal networks. But the most remarkable aspect of Clara May's legal proceedings wasn't her sentence. It was what happened after her release. Prison records show that Clara May Hensley served exactly 3 years and 2 months of her sentence before being granted parole for exemplary behavior and valuable assistance to law enforcement investigations. She had used her incarceration to study legal procedures, develop relationships with prison administrators, and establish the kind of reputation for reformed character that would serve her well in whatever life awaited beyond the prison walls. Upon her release in April of 1871, Clara May disappeared from official records with the same completeness that had characterized her victims vanishing from Kettle Creek Hollow. No employment records, no marriage certificates, no property deeds, nothing to suggest that the most notorious female criminal in Appalachian history had continued to exist after walking out of federal custody. But unofficial sources tell a different story. Love never dies, it evolves. Mountain folklore from the 1870s and 80s includes scattered references to a woman who traveled through remote mining camps and logging towns, offering domestic services to isolated men who worked dangerous jobs in places where questions weren't asked and backgrounds weren't checked. She was described as polite, efficient, and possessed of the kind of practical skills that made her valuable to employers who needed someone capable of managing households in hostile environments. What these employers discovered, invariably too late, was that their capable housekeeper had learned lessons during her years in Kettle Creek Hollow that extended far beyond cooking and cleaning. Men who hired her had a tendency to disappear during hunting trips or work accidents, leaving behind property and savings that somehow found their way into the possession of grieving domestic employees who claimed to be the only family the deceased had ever mentioned. The pattern continued for over a decade, moving steadily westward as mining booms and railroad construction created new populations of isolated men with valuable assets and limited social connections. Clara May had evolved beyond the crude methods of her mountain partnership, developing techniques that were virtually undetectable to frontier law enforcement and completely invisible to communities that were accustomed to the high mortality rates associated with dangerous occupations. By the time she reached California in the 1880s, Clara May Hensley had perfected an approach to serial murder that was both more sophisticated and more profitable than anything she had learned in Kettle Creek Hollow. She had become something unprecedented in American criminal history, a woman who killed not for passion or desperation, but as a sustainable business model that provided steady income and comfortable living while satisfying psychological needs that conventional society could never address. They say that in certain remote areas of Appalachia, mountain families still whisper warnings about accepting hospitality from women who seem too eager to help, too skilled at making men comfortable, too quick to offer services that nobody should provide for free. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.